Hello everybody and welcome back to Revolutionary Left Radio. I'm your host and comrade Brett O'Shea, and today we have on Michael Brooks from The Michael Brooks Show and The Majority Report and many other projects to talk about meditation and its connection to politics. So I hope you all enjoy this pretty unique episode of ours. Before we get into it, I just want to remind people that if you want to support the show and get bonus content, you can support us at patreon.com/RevLeftRadio. Or if you want to find our YouTube page, Red Menace, our sister podcast, or anything else, you can always go to revolutionaryleftradio.com. And one big way you can support the show without having to spend any money is by rating and reviewing us on whatever podcast app you use. It's a great way to increase our reach, and it costs nothing to do. So, having said all that, let's jump into this episode with Michael Brooks on meditation and Marxism.
I'm Michael Brooks. I'm a host of The Michael Brooks Show. That's sort of the home of my primary projects. I'm also a co-host on The Majority Report with Sam Seder. And I do another show which I'm really passionate about called Woke Bros with my good friend Wosny Lambre. Let's see. Well, I've been provoking people with this stuff recently, so I'll say I'm a Leo. And let's see. Had a lot of different paths in my 20s, and it's all sort of fused together in whatever this space we're in is, I guess, as, analyst, entertainer, provocateur.
Yeah, so as I was saying before we started recording, I've been listening to The Majority Report for a very long time. I was very familiar with you and your work for years before I started Rev Left. And then after I got started, I think I reached out to you or vice versa because we sort of, saw that we had a similar trajectory in our projects and we wanted to get something together, some sort of collaboration going. And we went back and forth. We had some ideas, but it just never happened. And then recently I heard you on Zero Books talking about psychedelics and meditation, and you talked about how you have your own meditation practice and go on retreats. And this is a topic that I've really wanted to cover on Rev Left, but I really couldn't find any inroads to it because it's sort of outside of the main topic spheres of what I discuss on Rev Left. But, hearing you talk about it and maybe thinking about like politics and some of the contradictions between meditation and Marxism, I thought we could sort of do an episode on meditation and tie it also into politics to make it sort of firmly in our wheelhouse here. So I really appreciate you coming on and us finally being able to do this collaboration. It's really cool to finally get to talk to you.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. My exact same feelings, brother.
Beautiful. All right, so first and foremost, I just ask this question to most guests just so people have sort of an orientation towards them. How do you identify politically?
That's interesting. And maybe this is I'll answer your question in a second. I will say I've gotten, even though I've been doing this for really a relatively short period of time, and definitely things have changed pretty radically in the last couple of years, and really even particularly last year in terms of, I think, basically my reach and sort of scope, and, still a lot more to do. But I think, even just kind of coming into the space a little bit when I was producing for Sam in 2012, there was a lot of Occupy was a very big deal, regardless of one's feelings about it. And actually, overall, I'm a defender of Occupy for its mistakes and so on. I think it was an incredibly important thing.
Same.
But, there was so much of a habit of so I always used to say that I was, basically some type of, either left or progressive or democratic socialist, I might say sometimes, and that I was analytically Marxist. And what I meant by that was that, when I took Capital in college, and I was an autodidact. I was a countercultural homeschooled kid. And I was pretty political, high school age, very much of the sort of, Noam Chomsky, kind of later end of anti-globalization protests. And I think I went through a phase of kind of wanting, I think, especially because I was so alienated, both in terms of, this very kind of obscure upbringing in a way, and dealing with a lot of kind of, serious material deprivation, but also just like a sense of disconnect from, power and institutions. I had a phase where I was, very interested in things like the third way and Clinton and Blair and Obama and this sort of thing. And while my politics never strayed that far in that direction, it was also frankly just a reflection then and up until really recently of just how limited politics were. And it's very interesting to me, although, and then as I say, in college when I actually had to study capital, and that was very much in a phase where I was reading The Economist, I was considering, I both totally temperamentally am not cut for it, and really I would have actually hated it, but it was like so freaked out about growing up with no money and so on that I was almost considering majoring in finance, which wasn't going to happen, but whatever. But I read Capital, and as soon as and the basic argument, and what was so distinct about reading Marx, and I'm sorry this is a long-winded answer,
That's
but
fine.
I think it's actually important, was that, yes, of course, I agreed with, Noam Chomsky describing how despicable U.S. foreign policy was, or, other, dissenters talking about, any number of like structural injustices, and certainly, particular areas like the civil rights era was something that always was very, very interesting to me. And foreign policy in general was something that I always looked at. But when you got that flip economically, which was like, okay, and realizing that it is actually a normative choice, that actually, the economics and capital, of course, it's been updated and developed as a field, both Marxist and non-Marxist, neoclassical, Keynesian, and Marxist, the kind of three basic options. But that there is actually a really basic, like this isn't math, there is an actual kind of political choice at the outset of economics. And that political choice is something profit, or is it stolen labor that's turned into profit, right? And and look, you can complexify that in some ways, and it's something we can have a conversation about that's worthwhile. But as a general presupposition and as a general orientation, as soon as I read that, to this day, the idea that, I perceive most work, and certainly work in any kind of multinational or anything like that, and whether it's incredibly privileged, well-treated work, or the most vicious, vindictive exploitation, whether you are, in the upper echelons of management at Google and highly compensated and, and so on, or whether you're in the most sort of brutal sweatshop conditions, obviously you're experiencing a totally different reality in terms of your level of oppression. But the structure of economic exploitation is the same, in the sense that your surplus is getting turned into somebody else's profit, not as a moral thing, but as a structural thing. So that has been my choice. And so in that sense, I'm very fundamentally Marxist. And so I think, I don't dwell too much on this, but I mean, clearly my goals are socialist. I want to democratize the economy. I want people to have the same, they don't really have it, but I think I do see socialism as the idea that, well, if people should have some real strong ownership and governance over themselves in political and civic spheres, then they absolutely should in economic spheres as well. And in fact, if they don't in economic spheres, then obviously the political sphere is not really liberated. And I'm a Marxist because I find Marxist tools to be mostly the most effective way of analyzing the world. I mean, that said, I mean, I'm pretty omnivorous in what I read and how I think, and some of the sort of fixation that people have right now in this kind of subculture on like specifically labeling themselves, I frankly find really off-putting, not because I oppose people being clear ideologically, but because I think it becomes a bit of a, kind of an obscurist counterculture game, which I'm not interested in. Yeah. But yes, that's how I define myself. Yeah. Sorry I gave you a lot there.
That's good. There's a lot to work with there. I definitely think that the obsession with specific tendencies and then going to war with other tendencies that are not your own is sort of like, one, it's sort of performative for social media. It's a way of having an identity online. And then it also is sort of a function of the generalized impotence of the left broadly, right? We have the luxury to sit back and nitpick about 1917 or make these nuanced divisions that any regular working class people would have no fucking clue what we're talking about. But it becomes an obsession and a way to express oneself in this neoliberal age. And so that on that level, I totally agree with you that it's something to be at least entered into with caution and be suspicious of those pitfalls and what this is actually generating. But one thing about you that I've realized, especially listening to you talk on Zero Books, is that you are also very much a historical materialist. You take that sort of lens to history and you apply it very well. Am I fair in saying that?
To the extent it's possible.
Yeah, right.
Definitely. Yes.
Definitely.
Yeah, yes.
All right. Well, that kind of eases us into this broader discussion about meditation. And the first question I want to ask is sort of related to that, which is, so what is meditation broadly, and out of what historical context did it arise? I know that's a huge question, so you can take that in any direction you want, but I'm just throwing it out there.
So I think meditation broadly is, and obviously this consumes so much, but I would say in a broad kind of practice sense, like something that maybe you'd have if we were having more the what type of meditation do you do kind of conversation. I think that the distinction really globally and really generally between, and again, even this gets really problematic because there's a lot of subtleties and distinctions inside this anytime you make such a crude distinction. But I do think that the notion that there's some practices that are sort of concentration and immersion practices, and then other practices that are more sort of awareness focused. And I do think that that's a pretty helpful distinction. And I notice in pop culture, or even just in anecdotally, a lot of people, if meditation comes up, people might say oh, I can't do that because I can't turn my thinking off. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like this and of course that literally never I don't know, even textually, including, I do think people can get into, very altered and distinct states meditating, but I don't think that would ever correlate with quote unquote, oh, I just don't think, or my mind is blank.
Right.
In fact, your mind is extremely textured. But at any rate, so I think a practice say a lot of people know mantra meditation, the idea that you kind of you focus on a singular object and you're kind of you're keeping your concentration on one thing. And then there's other meditation practices that really are about sort of almost globalizing your attention in a way that you can get a very sort of continuous, almost physiological response to your experiences. And again, it definitely is a field where there is some degree of how much can you describe what the sensation of picking up a racket and hitting a tennis ball is. I do think it's a very experiential thing, because there are a lot of metaphors and a lot of language that either sounds obscure or not really clear that can kind of click in when you're actually doing a practice. And then in the more historical dimension, I know I've done several different kinds of meditation practice, and I actually still, when I do meditate, which is not nearly as much as I would like, yeah. I do a couple of different types of practices, but I've had the most extensive experience in Vipassanā meditation, which is where the mindfulness craze comes from, and that sort of movement, and that's a secularized version of Vipassanā meditation, and that's actually a whole other, separate, worthwhile conversation. But as an example, Vipassanā, as it's taught now in the West, there's a fascinating history of it that, yes, no doubt textually, you can go back to classic Buddhist texts from the Pali Canon, which is where the original teachings of the Buddha are transcribed. And I say transcribed because my understanding is that the tradition was oral. and passed on orally for, I think, actually maybe even a couple hundred years before it was transcribed in written form. And that written form is in Pali, and that is the oldest. I mean, there's a massive Buddhist canon that compromises much of Asia, North and South, but the Pali canon is definitely the sort of most not as like a value judgment. It's just like the oldest Buddhist texts. And there are teachings in there that, they definitely correlate. Like, okay, yes, like this is a teaching that the Buddha gave on observing breath, observing body sensations, observing mental states. Like, yes, it's, some form of what people are doing today is there, right? There is a certain continuity. Then there's also the reality that, in Burma, as an example, when Burma was dealing with its colonial relationship with the British, and there was a sort of attempt from the colonial administration to sort of disincentivize such a strong relationship between the community and Buddhism, partially because they were freaked out about the Sepoy mutiny that had happened in British colonially administered India, right? And that was a religiously influenced uprising that was actually, I don't know much about it, but I know that the British put it down. And it's countless, but that's worth looking up. Like the brutality of how they put it down. They shot people out of cannons, I recall. Jesus. I mean, just a truly vicious, grotesque thing. So what the Burmese did, among other things, was so the monks, as an example, and I think this is in the 19th and leading into the 20th century, they started doing, and it's funny because you can see kind of a correlation to today. So they started to say like, oh, well, some of these, instead of just kind of like, kind of more general teachings for the public, let's bring out some of these monastic practices. The middle class might be interested in them. There was a thing that was also interesting, which is a lot of the, and this still actually happens, my understanding is, but a lot of the Burmese teachers would teach behind a fan, so their faces would be covered. And the idea is actually kind of nice, which is a sort of like a kind of anti-cult, anti-personality sort of notion. Like, this is the teaching, it's not the kind of personality that's delivering it. But it's also, it's also can be quite stuffy and conservative in its own form of like mystification. So monks started doing what they called fan down teaching. And that was a more, direct way of engaging in the public. Anyways, to make a long story short, by the time we get to the 1950s, which is before before a military junta, which would take over Burma and rename it Myanmar, do you have the Vipassana teachings getting steadily updated, changed, different monks and different lay teachers actually adding different methods of how to actually teach this practice. And then, a independent government in Burma that actually helps fund, like some of these monks going and teaching overseas in Japan or the United States. And there was actually I think it was the 4th or 5th Buddhist council held in Burma in the 50s. And so clearly, there's also this this Burmese government is seeing Buddhism and Vipassana as a tool of its foreign policy and a tool of its sort of identity basically in Asian post-colonial politics. And, and again, and as I say, as I look at this, what I love is that none of this in any way takes from the tradition, the potency of the teaching, the continuity. I like Gramsci in the sense of like looking at things in an integral way. Like when I say historically material, I don't want to reduce it and say, oh no, it's one thing. It's all of the above. But on the other hand, what historical materialism does that's so rich and so dynamic is instead of, and particularly I think when people deal with stuff that comes from Asia, it's like if it comes from Buddhism, it's positive mystification. It comes from Islam, it's negative mystification.
Right.
But it's like, oh, here are these unbroken chains of these just magical pre-existing things, and they're in the text. Versus like, no, this is This is economics and sex and psychology and geography, like literally everything else. And it doesn't detract from it. It just means that it's part of the same rich, human predicament we're all dealing with.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. That was a very difficult question, but you did mention you really focused on Vipassana there, and that's the sort of tradition that I'm most used to. I think that's because the Insight Meditation Society, there were these Americans that were born in like the 40s and 50s that traveled the world and brought these practices back and then explained them. And I think we'll get into that in a bit. But so there's this broad, huge historical context. There's a million different manifestations of this practice we broadly know as meditation, and it takes, it blossoms in different ways depending on the culture and the time period that it's blossoming in. But would it be fair to say that the core practices of meditation are sort of transcultural, in that sort of like science or mathematics, they have very specific cultural beginnings, but they can sort of be taken out of any given cultural context and put into different ones, sometimes grotesquely, sometimes beautifully. But, the practice itself is like the core that can be, that's why, you and I can participate in this practice, even though this practice stems back 2,500 years ago to India and the Asian subcontinent. So is that a good way to think about the practice?
Yeah, no, I buy that. And I think even globally, there was a book that came out ages ago called The Perennial Philosophy by Aldous Huxley. Mm-hmm. And I know it's the type of thing that is very much like, I'm sure you could not cite it if you were taking a comparative religion class. It's, it's not academically precise. And I understand, this kind of new push right now. And this is actually, to me, is in some ways a very problematic push, because obviously, and in some ways a really absolutely necessary push. But there's a push that's interesting because in some versions comes from more liberal, quote unquote, identity politics, but actually some of it, like one of the most elegant defenses of cultural difference and distinction was written by Jonathan Sachs that I read. It was called The Dignity of Difference. And he's actually a very conservative, ultra-Orthodox rabbi in the UK and a totally brilliant writer. I mean, I have a really profoundly different worldview from him, but he's a very impressive speaker and writer. So this argument is like, no, it's not the perennial philosophy. It's, these are, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, Taoism, and so on. Like, these are all radically different things. They mean radically different things. They teach radically different things. And then, of course, like the new atheist stuff, came along and was like, no, this is all radically different. And in fact, of course, we know the goodies and the baddies. And I get all of those points for sure. But I think what actually does hold up, to be honest, is inside all religions, there clearly are people that had a relationship to their religious faith that was experiential, for lack of a better word, quote unquote, spiritual. And it usually correlated with taking on different types of meditative practices that, had their own sort of systems that had some degree of ability to move inside and out of particular contexts. And I think, honestly, objectively, and this is one where I will, assert a difference. I do think a practice like Vipassana, it is it's funny because it's so inseparable from Buddhism. Mm-hmm. But I do think it's obviously a huge advantage that you can sit and do that practice, and it does not require, there's no you don't need to visualize any Buddha. You don't need to do anything, with your hands. It's physiological. I think it's a huge advantage. So I think you're totally right. And I actually think that that's true to some extent across the board, actually.
Yeah, interesting. And one thing about meditation practice specifically is that it doesn't really require you in and of itself to believe anything metaphysical or ontological about the world. What it is at its core is, here is a prescription for you to try, like a sort of experiment for you to run, and here are the results and benefits you will get if you conduct this experiment in this way, and then you can go see it for yourself. So it doesn't really require you to believe anything absurd about the world or anything radically different than you were brought up in, and that also allows it to jump between not only different Asian traditions, but you have Christian mystics who incorporate meditation. You have complete atheists and scientific materialists who can work with meditation, and so that's sort of its beauty. But I guess in a basic sense, and I assume a lot of people listening don't know anything or pretty much anything about meditation other than sort of pop cultural chunks here and there. So in a basic sense, what are people actually doing when they are meditating, and what are they sort of not doing?
There's a lot of different techniques for how this is taught, actually. And I want to actually put in a plug. My friend Jesse Vega Frey, who, it's so amazing because, he's also, maybe, I don't know, maybe he's a year older than me or so, but, another guy in his mid-30s, and we've been friends and kind of like brothers in this practice and our friendship now for like 16, 17 years. And I'm seeing, like, he's becoming an incredibly, I just did a retreat that he co-led, and he's like emerging as this like really great teacher and somebody who also is very of this moment, with a different kind of cultural trapping than a lot of the kind of, baby boomer ethos that still sort of hangs over so much of this stuff. And he has a book he's working on where he uses manuals from like guerrilla warfare, like Ho Chi Minh and Che, to regenerate the mindfulness teachings.
Wow.
Which is fascinating.
Wow.
So, because as an example, like, and this will get into where we're going, because I actually think this is a really important point. And it's certainly influenced my ability. I've been really lucky with some of the teachers that I get to study with. His point is that if you go into the classical Buddhist literature, there's a lot of war imagery, right? And it will be a lot, and it's fun. It's kind of like when the enemies of greed, hatred, and delusion amass their forces, then you counteract with your forces of wisdom, love, and discernment, or so. And in some ways it's very cool because it really is an extremely strategic practice. It's very like, okay, go in, ease off, check this out, don't check that out right now, type of thing. He said, what I love is he's like, look, but let's be honest. And one of the things I love about this that I think is so relevant for the left and us generally is like, and also, frankly, for us being way more forgiving and less toxic with each other, is like, we're all extremely, we're all very much works in progress, to say the least.
Yeah.
And what Jesse said is like, look, like, let's be honest, like, a lot of times, like, those forces of like, greed, hatred, delusion, like, they're fucking overwhelming. They're like a superpower. And what we're doing in this practice is like, we're a little guerrilla brand, and we come down from the hills, and maybe like actually now I'm putting words in his mouth because I don't think he'd take the metaphor this full, but like, we go in, we do a little operation, and then we run back up into the hills.
Yeah.
And I think it's important because how you frame what you're doing will affect, how you do it. And honestly, there's so many different ways in which this is taught, because there's even an understanding that different personality traits come in, with a different tendency, right? Like, so there's some people where it's like, they're going to go in and fucking bulldoze themselves in a way that can be really unhelpful and maybe even counterproductive, right? And there's other people that maybe will approach it in a super lazy way, and they need to like get a kick in the ass. But I mean, generally speaking, the typical teaching is that you actually work initially to establish a certain level of concentration. That method of finding concentration is by following the physical sensation of the rising and falling of the breath. I've primarily been taught that you focus on your abdomen, that your breath is correlated with the rise and fall of your abdomen. Other people teach focusing on the sensation at the tip of your nostrils, I'll just say for me, I found the abdomen to be a lot more kind of grounding and helpful
I agree
than
totally.
the nostrils. Yeah, yeah, you have the same experience.
Exactly. Yeah, I kept hearing this, like, follow the tip of your nostrils sort of thing, and it was fine. But then I just eventually, like, sort of settled into my own routine where I would focus on the abdomen, and I've got a lot more out of it. So that's just me personally.
Yeah, yeah. So exactly. So then from there, you kind of first you expand your awareness, and this is the sort of typical progression is of sensations throughout your body. And so you might do, the way I've been taught usually is you kind of do a sweep, where you kind of you place the attention on your face, you place the attention on your neck, your chest, move down your body. But then it becomes really just a kind of, again, it's a very dynamic, it's not a static process. But say you're sitting and you're like, okay, I have a little bit of concentration established from kind of focusing on my breath. So that basically, and it does not mean, again, going back to the beginning of the conversation, doesn't mean you have stopped thinking or anything like that. It doesn't mean you stopped making plans. It doesn't mean you've stopped, feeling great about something or feeling guilty about something else, all of the shit that people go through. It just means that you have a certain degree of stability achieved in your concentration, so that you can deal with all of that stuff that's rushing at you, but not like go with it. Like, okay, and again, not push it away, but not necessarily go with it, right? So it isn't like that kind of like violent, like, that was another big misconception for me in meditation, it wasn't just like, oh, I'm not gonna really go on that ride right now. It was like, no, that's not happening right now. Like, fuck that, get back to the breath. That kind of, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
that
exactly.
Kind of very violent, actually.
It sort of re-entrenches the ego a little bit,
Yeah, especially if you think of the ego as just like habit in a way.
Right.
It's like all like just those reflex, and then you really start to realize. It is terrifying if you kind of realize in a certain way that like your relationship to yourself in this very dynamic way is a mirror of your reflection of your relationship to everybody else. And you can both see the ways in which like you are so terrible, and also other ways in which you allow yourself to be treated so terribly.
Mm-hmm.
And in both ways. And again, I think it's another really important kind of check on, the just the sort of, the shticks that people get into in the political space, because they're not really being real with themselves. The reason I say this is because I'm trying in my own incredibly, I'm on my own journey, to say the least. And I'm even trying to talk about more of this stuff, because I think that we all need to be a little bit more humble and a little bit more forgiving and a little bit more real about the difficulties that we all have, right? The mistakes we all make, and so on. So anyways, then it's like, I love it. I'm going to say this, and like 5 minutes later, I'm going to be like doing an impression of like Dave Rubin. But anyways, but actually that's great. And that doesn't contradict what I'm saying at all. So then there's body sensations, and you're kind of like, okay, I'm focusing on my breath, and then I'm going to check out a body sensation. Then there's the next level, or I shouldn't say level. The next phase might be thoughts. All right, like what's going on in this thought process. Then it might be, and then it's emotions. And then of course you kind of realize like, there's a progression, right? So you realize like, okay, an emotion is usually some kind of fusion of a physical sensation and a thought, right? You can kind of get, it's very funny because it's like the stereotype of these practices is almost that they like zone you out. And what you really get is almost like is like a huge amount of precision in your sort of actual experience. I mean, it's very like heightening. It's not. I mean, you don't want it to be over heightening either. That's actually an imbalance. But it's definitely not like a kind of wide-eyed smile, kind of like controlled fake bliss that I think people associate with this stuff a lot in pop culture.
Yeah, I think when you see pictures of people meditating, or like Mad Men at the end of that series where he's sitting there sort of blissed out, it can seem like a form of escapism. My sort of thinking is what you're doing when you're meditating, and you hear a lot of teachers say this a lot, is like you're not adding anything to your experience. You're not actually doing anything. What you're technically doing, quote unquote, is just becoming aware of the sort of constantly shifting sensations, noises, feelings, emotions, moods, and thoughts that go through, a human being multiple times a day. You're sitting back and sort of watching those processes happen. And through that awareness, through that systematic and methodical watching of how your mind and body actually operate and change constantly, you start to detach from this hyper association with those thoughts and feelings, right? Like instead of starting to think like you author all your thoughts and you become sort of a slave to your thoughts and your feelings, you can stand back from them, create a little distance, and view them dispassionately. Almost, I always say like watching clouds go by. You're not swept up in the chaos of your constantly changing thoughts and emotions, but you actually get to have some distance and become aware of how they operate. And the awareness is really doing all of the work. You're not doing anything outside of just being aware, ideally.
Yep. Yeah, totally. That's beautiful.
Yeah. So I guess let's just go into the misunderstandings, because this is definitely related. So what are some of the most common misunderstandings about meditation that you've come across, specifically here in the West, because we're largely talking to a Western audience?
The misunderstandings, as I said, are one that, I can't do meditation because I can't shut my brain off. First of all, for a practice like Vipassana, that's not at all what you're doing, because you're bringing a certain attention and bearing to like everything across the board. And then, I think even practices where I could see where that misconception would come from, you're not doing that either. You know what I mean? Like in a way, you're certainly like using your brain if you're doing a mantra practice, right? Like I do a mantra practice sometimes for Kali. And, that's not like emptying your brain. More globally, I think that there is a really interesting conversation to be had, which again, I'll mention my friend Jesse Vega Frey, where it's like, on one hand, I think a lot of people like in the political space now, well, I'll be blunt in general. I mean, I think in general, they're just way too rejecting of any form of spirituality, right? And so I'm somebody that, again, I just, and to me also, ironically, a lot of my defense is as a materialist, right? I'm like, in fact, like liberation theology is a significant thing, right?
Yeah.
Latin America, you can like it or not, but that is the reality of that political configuration. So that's part of it. But that being said, there's definitely some accurate criticisms of, certainly if we take it back just specifically to meditation, the way these, practices have been deployed and the rhetoric around them. And what's interesting to me, though, is that somebody like Jesse, he wrote a great piece on he called it genetically modified Dharma. Or the Buddhist bourgeoisie blues. Mm-hmm. His point was like, there's so much quote unquote science validating meditation right now. And I'm not like opposed to that. I think actually a lot of people doing that stuff have very good intentions, and they really do actually have a really strong, and I get it, like it's funny, like as cultish almost as it can sound, frankly, there is a part of me that's like, you do a 10-day meditation retreat. And I don't think everybody should do the same meditation practice. I certainly don't think that everybody should be a Buddhist or whatever. I don't care about any of that. But you do get a feeling of like, Jesus, if everybody could get a dose of this experience, it wouldn't like solve all of our problems by any stretch, but that would be very nice.
Definitely.
It would be very nice if every human being could have an opportunity to access this, right?
Yes.
But Jesse's point is like, to be honest, like if you really dive into Buddhism or into certain like Vipassana, like it could be really counterproductive. Like it could increase your stress. You might like he talked about this funny example of struggling with I forget what it was, but like a real health thing in the same essay. And he had just gotten back from intensive practice in Burma, and his doctor's like, you should meditate more. You should lessen your stress. He's kind of like sort of like in the phase of this practice where it can get actually really stressful because you're dealing with mortality. You're dealing with, and there's also structural contradictions. Like it's not to say that, well, because I think we can, program things to be anything they are. You can have a fascist Buddhism, you can have a communist Buddhism, whatever. But one thing that is very clear about it is like there is an interesting and weird contradiction between a practice that is primarily marketed right now as it will increase your efficiency and your ability to succeed when, textually, and this is the flip side. I mean, this is what a lot of the people on the left don't like, and I understand it because it definitely is not necessarily intervening in politics, but it's also kind of not intervening in anything. I mean, it is a pretty monastic, world-renouncing tradition to a degree. There's endless teachings on why, like, building your empire won't get you fulfillment. Or that, if you are a householder, you should like take care of your business and live a good life, but that isn't like, that's not ultimately where it's at, basically. So I think that, there's broad kind of pop culture misconceptions that, you just bliss out, you turn your brain off. Then there's the misconception, I think, from the left that these practices and holding any type of spiritual or religious context is innately contradictory of politics or a materialist viewpoint. I have to say, for me, I find that particularly ironic because I've been in conversations where I'm the one sort of batting for spirituality, but on the other hand, I definitely am bringing the most historical materialist point to bear in the argument. And particularly, when you talk, I'll be really specific, when you're talking around people who are sort of, I mean, they're better because they have a bit more left politics, but they're really coming from that kind of new atheist place, which ironically it's not a materialist worldview. It's a totally ideational worldview.
Deeply, yeah.
So, they're idealists.
Oh my God, exactly. Yeah. Sam Harris, I always say Sam Harris's take on Islam is like a great example of trying to understand regional conflict through a purely idealist lens, where he boils it all down to the beliefs inherent in Islam and not the socio-cultural, historical context that these conflicts erupt in, etc. So I totally agree with that.
Exactly, and it's funny because even as I I keep saying I think a lot of the spiritual stuff is I'll even go so far as to say it's actually really important. But I think one way of describing like the materialist worldview versus an idealistic one is that people like you and I, we look at the world, and actually Doug Lane helped really articulate this for me. Was that we look and we say, what do people do all day? Like, where do they drive? Where do they work? What are their relationships? And then how does that inform how they think? Now, obviously, it's a feedback loop because then how you think is going to reinforce, I think ultimately it is an integral thing. But the starting point is, what do you literally do all day? And then how does that affect how you think? I mean, people like, whether it's Sam Harris or even, frankly, plenty of people in the New Age movement, they think, what do you think? And then what happens after that?
Yep.
I tend to think in completely the opposite direction.
Absolutely.
So, so then there's that. And then there's the other, not the kind of old, hippie pop culture thing, but that meditation is like the like ultimate killer app of success. I watched the show Billions,
Yeah.
It's kind of a fun show, and it's just so funny because like these characters are just like assholes, and they meditate, and they because that's part of like, I got to go to the meditation chamber and like really figure out like fuck somebody in some deal.
Yeah, that's so wonderfully said, and I think it really displays all those things you said, display on your end a sort of dialectical thinking, right? Nothing is purely black or white. Nothing is purely good or bad. Trying to take this more conciliatory path, understanding both sides of things, can really help sort of a rigid leftist put down their defenses a little bit and engage with this topic more meaningfully. I just want to reiterate some of the common misunderstandings that you said quickly. You keep saying that people, and I get this all the time when I recommend it to my friends. I even have a buddy who is who's a neuroscientist and a postdoctoral work in neuroscience, and I constantly telling him to try this meditation thing because he would benefit from it. And one of the big things I hear all across the board is, I'm just not the type. I can't meditate. I sit down, my mind is too chaotic, and they give up and walk away from the practice. But that actually is the first revelation of the practice, right? It's known as the monkey mind, that once you sit down and try to concentrate, you'll find just how chaotic your mind is. Try to sit down right now and put this on pause, sit down and try not to think a thought for 10 seconds. And you'll find out that you are utterly unable to do that. And that should not be the cause of you turning away from the practice. That, at least for me, is like, that's the first revelation. That's exactly why I need to keep up with the practice to get beyond that. And then the second misunderstanding, which you touched on a little bit, is that it's pretty much just a breath exercise, when in reality, in this tradition, the breath exercise is what you will always start out with, because it's precisely the way for you to build that concentration, that ability to focus your attention on an object for a long period of time, that will allow you to take the deeper steps later on when you're talking about open awareness and you're talking about turning that concentration inward for insights into the nature of impermanence and selflessness, etc. So, these are like really the first potholes that I think people step in, and I would just urge them to contextualize those things and keep moving forward. If you sit down and realize that your mind is just pure chaos all the time, good. You're doing the right thing. Continue with the practice, and you will deepen that understanding,
No, that's so beautifully put. And that actually really gets to like, and it's a problematic translation, but like the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism, and like the first insight that life is suffering, or I would say, I think translations like unsatisfying or like even just like frustrating or filled with agita, because even, it's like, good experiences are followed by bad experiences. You have good things, but then you're attached to them, so then they become a source of stress. And again, I think it's tricky because I don't want to. Obviously, I think there's a tremendous amount of joy and pleasure in life, and I think people should, engage in that. And it's good to be here too, right? Like I think that could be balanced by some other really important perceptions, but there's such a fundamental truth to it, and you get that fundamental truth if you sit down and right, exactly. Your friend, that's so perfect. Like, oh, I'm just not the type. It's like, well, first of all, you're like the human type. Because I mean, I don't know. Maybe there's like a fraction of people on Earth who don't have like, sure, I'm sure some people are slightly more, obviously, certain people have different temperaments or whatever. But like, everybody's incredibly mentally agitated. And you sit down and you're like, oh, this person did that. I got to do this. And oh, fuck. And oh, man, do you remember like in the second season of Peaky Blinders? Or oh, shit, I missed that. I want to go to a Knick game. Or, it's like, yeah, it's fucking disaster. Right. That's the first. That's literally, all the stuff is very systemic and very strategic. And that's the first step. It's like, see, it's not looking so good.
Yeah. and talking about that unsatisfactoriness, it's dukkha, it's translated as suffering, but really you're getting at this more nuanced take where it's like this constant unsatisfactoriness. And one way to understand that is that we all have this constant flow of desires, whether this desire out of boredom to get up and go look in the fridge, or this desire to pursue some career or life goal. But what we find, and we especially see this when the contradictions intensified in the form of hyper famous, hyper rich people, is you see that once they obtain the thing that they're constantly desiring, this unsatisfactoriness sets back in, and they go crazy because their whole culture has told them amass fame and wealth, consume and express yourself, and become famous and rich, and that is the sort of way towards happiness. And once you get there, you realize that no, even with everything that society conventionally tells me is the things that I should be pursuing, I'm still stuck with this fundamental sense of not quite ever being satisfied. I'm always reaching for the next moment. I'm always looking for something external to me for me to finally be happy. And what the Buddha said is, this is the sort of fundamental dysfunction of the mind, and you will never get that thing. You pursue and pursue and pursue, and then you die. And so to be in that frame of mind is a sort of cause of suffering. And even when you are happy, by wanting to hold on to that joyful moment and never let it go, it already starts to slip through your fingers like sand, And so even in the best moments, they're impermanent, they're temporary, and then you will go back down to bad moments. And so just trying to stand back and watch the river pass, as opposed to constantly being shoved and bobbed inside the river, is sort of one metaphor way to look at this problem and how to address it.
I just want to add really quick to that, two quick things. I mean, one, this is actually one of the reasons that I'm basically like very much pro Russell Brand overall.
Me too. I've come around to that. Yeah.
Yeah. I just think, in addition to the fact that I think he has done some things that are actually really great politically. And I think he's genuinely open. I think if you look at the way he talks about his spiritual, interests and pursuits, it's fascinating, because he's very self-aware, and he's actually giving you a dose of what you're talking about. And again, he's not doing it in a way that's like, bullshit, because let's be honest, like, he's created a life that, this is the other part where it's like being real. Like, yeah, that's a very enjoyable life. There's a lot of great benefits to it that he's achieved and acquired. And, he's not pretending that he's going to get rid of it. But then he's also very openly basically saying, like, through various addictions, through career accomplishments, like, yeah, there's still a huge amount here that feels fucking awful. And so I'm kind of sincerely engaging in these pursuits. And I think that's cool. Like, to me, that's my just sort of like 30,000 feet view of that is like, that is a positive model in the world. And I also just want to say really quickly too, that like the funny result, like, I think there's plenty of people, frankly, that, and I had a whole period of time where I needed to definitely step away from these practices, and even like the culture of them, which I think is to some extent a separate thing, that people can interpret these things, whether or not it's in the focus of, a lot of our work as like, oh, well, I'm not going to engage in the world, or I'm not going to, deal with the ecological crisis, or the political dimension. But even also like, oh, well, I meditate, so I'm kind of like a purse-lipped bore. I do think some people have, and I will say on the flip side, the people that I've been around that are like the real models in terms of teachers, that I've been around, and again, they're not perfect. And this is another important thing, is I don't think there's any process that totalizes anybody. We're all still products of our conditions, and, nobody is perfect by any stretch. But people who really have cultivated something here to the point where you could say like, oh, these are human beings that are super admirable, and they're living in a way that is definitely significantly better than the average. They have extremely full and dynamic and engaged and very alive personalities. So it actually does not lead you to this sort of like, the kind of like the college kid who's like misread, like, the Stoics, and is like frustrated that like the dating life isn't going that way, and is like, well, I'm not tempted by the senses. It's not that at all.
Yeah, exactly. It does not produce. And I've been fascinated with like the highest achievers in this realm, and for a long time I've sought them out and try to see how do they live their lives, how do they talk, and that was sort of a concern early on in my life too. Is like, if I do this practice, right, this whole idea of like getting rid of the self, is that going to just sort of turn me into some drone, some soulless, conformed thing that's not really me? And you're exactly right. It's the exact opposite. It lets all of the weirdest parts and the most interesting parts of your personality take really beautiful form. And you see, like with a Joseph Goldstein, for example, who is a big, leader and teacher in Vipassanā, just like the sort of effortless way that he laughs and he can sit in any conversation and be totally present. That is, I think, where a lot of this cashes out. And it doesn't make him dull. It doesn't make him anything other than like a really unique individual person. And the higher you climb this ladder, I think the more unique you get, because whatever is inside of every individual human being that makes them different from everybody else, that's really allowed to grow and blossom in an interesting way. And you're right, it's never finished. You can even, in Buddhist tradition, you can talk about multiple lives, and like the pursuit of enlightenment happens over hundreds or thousands of lives. And whether or not you want to take that literally or not, the idea it's getting at is that you're going to be constantly in a process of development. You don't reach an end point. And insofar as you can get enlightened, it's not like everything stops for you. It's a matter of deepening that enlightenment and deepening that insight, that understanding, even in that context. So, this notion that it's a perpetually unfolding process and not just like a thing that you climb the ladder and get to the top rung of, I think is an important thing to keep in mind as well.
Definitely.
Let's talk about benefits, right? We hear a lot of the benefits, and you gestured earlier towards the scientific approach where they're trying to scientifically pin down, the benefits of people. But personally, what have the benefits been for you in your life? And maybe after you talk about the many benefits, maybe talk about like the single most impactful aspect that this practice has had on your life.
I mean, that's just a really interesting, to me in some ways, like, and it feels so weird because I just, you don't ever want to be in a position of like, I just keep saying, I just still have just so much to work on. But I would say, in those moments that it gives you the capacity to really not be at the circumstance of passing thoughts and emotions, no matter how intense, there's a state of freedom or reset and ability to do things that is just so radically better. I don't, and I also have no doubt that, like, I do think on some level, like, I don't think it's because of it, but even in a really broad way, I think that, like, having had some periods of my life where I've done a decent amount of somewhat intensive practice, I think it actually has helped me in terms of hosting, in terms of creativity, comedy. It, in some ways, because everything is kind of opened up and you're less contracted, it does allow things to go a lot more sort of naturally and elegantly, because you're just not constantly getting tripped up. And then look, I think I've had some other experiences where, again, it's like, I don't want to scare people, but I've had some experiences where it's like, I think in the immediate circumstances of doing some of these things, it has not been helpful in a conventional sense, which has been like, oh shit, that was really fucking intense. I'm going to process that. And of course, maybe even led to, I'm realizing now, not getting too personal, but I think that I'm sort of looping back to this stuff. I think I had the period of several years of the kind of like disillusioned, like, oh man, whatever, and then really realizing like how painful that cynicism and that hardening is. In a more relative sense, look, if I'm in a schedule where I'm meditating and working out with some regularity, life is just better. I don't really know how to kind of put it better than that. Like, you're definitely less stressed. You're probably being less of an asshole. You're probably, it's probably undermining and contradicting whatever your addictions and habits are. And I'm using that in a really broad sense. So I don't want to, I don't want to I'm definitely not trying to diminish anybody who's like actually dealing with like a capital A addiction.
Yeah.
But I do think in a vernacular sense, we are like, I am addicted to my phone. I am.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's not good. You know what I'm saying? So no, of course it's not the same thing as, an actual like substance area, but it is actually not a good thing that diminishes life and, decreases quality and connection and so on. People have all sorts of compulsive areas, and I think that it definitely makes you calmer, happy. As much as I sort of resist the sort of scientism, it's like, look, it does. It makes you calmer. It makes you happier. Almost certainly you will deal with your circumstances better.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And insofar as it helps with like sort of habits like that or bad habits, is that, it's exactly what we're talking about with awareness, is if you can cultivate this level of awareness, then when that first little urge, that first little desire to do the habit crops up, if you can maintain some awareness, you can see it arise. And in that sense, you can sort of veto it in a way, right? You can say, oh, I see this thing coming up. This is where I go to the fridge and pull out the food. But, this time I'm going to check that impulse because I know that it's just this ultimately bad thing. And that little distance, that little sliver of awareness that gives you that second to veto that, I think is important. So some of the benefits for me, and I definitely don't want to oversell these. It's not some radical transformation. I'm very fucking human. And as Michael's said many times, I'm much closer to the never having meditated at all side of the spectrum than the I'm literally a Buddha side of the spectrum. So I don't want to come off as anything but just a genuinely curious amateur who's been doing this off and on for a very long time. But one of the best benefits for me is in the same way that you can sort of check a bad habit, you can check negative emotions. And when I have anger or anxiety or jealousy, when I'm actually putting this stuff into practice, a lot of times this shit sneaks through and I'm an asshole about it. But once in a blue moon, when you can get that awareness, you can feel that anger or that anxiety or that jealousy or that negative emotion not as some cerebral story you're telling yourself that sort of continues to fuel the flames of that emotion, but you drop that conceptual apparatus and feel it as a physical sensation in the body. And when I'm able to do that, I am literally at the best times able to kill anger or anxiety or jealousy right in its tracks. And you just spot it, you see the energy form and then dissolve. And you're not thinking, so you're not feeding that energy, that emotional feeling. You're not feeding it with an inner narrative that keeps it going. And that's one of the things that's really helped out in my interpersonal life and my family life. I don't dwell on things. I try not to hold grudges. And then the other thing that I really want to focus on, and this is something I want to get your thoughts on, is the sort of brightening or the expansion of aesthetic appreciation. So I find that when I'm meditating and I take this meditation out into nature specifically, and I quiet down the internal dialogue, I quiet down the chatter constantly going on in my mind for a little bit, that my mind starts to default to a deeply aesthetic place. The wind through the leaves, the sun on a puddle in the middle of the street, everything sort of brightens and becomes more beautiful. And, I've had peak experiences of sort of being brought to tears over the joy or beauty that this practice has led me to sort of see. Because when you're not interpreting your world through this thick veil of constant inner dialogue, you can sort of see the beauty of everything more precisely. And so I think, like, what are your thoughts on the aesthetic dimension of it? Because it almost seems to me that, outside of the internal chatter, the quote unquote default setting of the human mind is sort of a beauty appreciating machine. And that's something I've gotten out of this practice. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I think that's totally beautiful. I love that. I think, and I haven't, I want to actually be more mindful of that in my own practice now that you put that so well. It's inspiring. But yeah, there's no doubt that I just got off of, I hadn't sat a retreat in quite some time, and I actually just did a retreat about a month ago. And like walking on the property by Insight Meditation Society, which is where I did this retreat, there's a lot of, there's a lot of land that the center owns, and then there's some like state owned. So there's some very beautiful like central Massachusetts, New England ecology, and it's like, yes, you can walk, and it's like, sure, always, yes, that's beautiful, that's lovely, but you can really get into a state of like, wow, like let's really take in like how green
Yeah,
those
green.
leaves are, the
Exactly.
texture, how the smell is hitting you. And I think, and it's absolutely the same, in a totally different way of like, filling your senses in the middle of New York City, like, because that's actually one of the things that, for all of the fucking, well, the politics of all of the problems of this city, and then not wanting to actually romanticize, the pre-gentrification, pre-oligarchic, but where, New York is cool on some level is just like, if you like it, some people don't, but it's just like the just rush of impressions. It's like there's cab, there's this, there's that. Like sometimes that's actually exhilarating, and you can actually apply the same energy to it. I want to just also loop. Just really briefly too, everything you said about the sort of how you relate to emotions, 100%. There's an experience of things being less sticky. I want to add, there's a woman that is also like a important. I've actually had the privilege of studying personally with Joseph Goldstein, and then
Wow.
the woman Michelle McDonald is another incredibly. She's probably my, she and Joseph are my main Vipassana teachers, and I've had others that are really important in that tradition. But there's a woman, Susan Green, that I've been doing a lot of work with the last couple of years, and she's, more like in that, very much in the sort of like, I guess like basically Hindu tradition. And she's actually gotten like, yeah, jealousy is not a good one, but she's kind of down with anger. She thinks anger can be extremely healthy and powerful. And when you get into this like, like Kali imagery, this idea, Kali's like portrayed in this incredibly melodramatic and violent way. She's got like skull necklaces and everything, but there's one version of the teaching that she's basically like the destroyer of all of that threatens innocence, which is really interesting. Sort of like this machine against, all of the forces that are, poisoning Earth or whatever. So I think there's also a way, but I think where they correlate, the traditions and the way they speak about energy and stuff is extremely different. But they think that where they correlate in some ways is that like the anger itself, it's like it could be super appropriate. Like this is a trivial example, but it's like it's not actually. I'm not even going to do that. It's a somewhat good example. When I'm on air or you're doing your podcast, right? This happened the other night. I wasn't planning. Yeah, I sound like Alex Jones, totally unprompted. But like I was talking about, Ilhan Omar and all of this, this fucking travesty with Trump and the 4 congresswomen and so on. And I got pissed off, and I did and I spoke from a place of passion and hopefully clarity. And I know some people it means a lot when any of us speak like that authentically, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that really can't be planned or put on. Now, that's another reason, by the way, that I know I'm obsessed. I'll do the reference. That's another reason. Lula is just such an unbelievable political leader. It's just that the realness that comes across in his speeches and his communication, I was unparalleled. But so it's like when I do that, and I'm expressing anger, I'm expressing disgust, but I'm actually also expressing a lot of admiration and solidarity, a lot of different things. That's a totally different and cleaner expression than when I go on Twitter and call somebody an asshole.
Exactly.
And I think the difference is that, one is super separate, super mental, super repetitive. And the other is just kind of like, oh, like I got that out. And that was really important, right? Like it's not that sticky, repetitive, like, well, they said this, they did that, da 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 da, all of that bullshit. The actual expression of like something like anger can be totally clean.
Yeah.
You know.
That's super interesting, and I deeply agree with that. And I'm sort of thinking as you're talking, like, where is this distinction, right? Because anger is a big word, and there's lots of emotions packed into that one big word we call anger. And so on that side, because I also am very emotive, and I think part of the reason I'm so emotive and can be so quickly emotive is because of my meditation practice. It sort of makes me more raw to the injustices of the world. It makes me more sort of like heartbroken when it comes to other people's, especially innocent people's suffering. And so there's an anger that stems out of compassion for innocent people that is more properly called probably righteous indignation, where, you know, you're moved to speak out vociferously against a deep injustice and to speak out with not holding any bars or, you know, taking the NPR Democracy Now sort of civility tone and just speaking the truth to power sort of thing. And then there's the other sort of anger, which often is rooted in insecurity, egoism, and oftentimes fear even. Like Joseph Goldstein said, you know, one time I heard him in his talk that a lot of times anger is really just fear coming out in a different way. And I realized that this is a little anecdote from my life, but when my fiance was pregnant with our son, we were driving at night, and she was in the passenger seat, and my daughter, who must have been 5 or 6 at the time, was in her car seat in the back. And we were stopped at this intersection, getting ready to take a turn, waiting for the other cars to pass, and just got fucking back slammed by a car who didn't even touch the brakes, right?
Oh,
boom!
Jesus Christ.
I look over, and my daughter's screaming in fear when all the metal stopped clanging and we're off the side of the road. My fiance's bawling, holding her stomach, and I don't have time to think. What I did is I jumped out of my car, and I was fucking furious. I was going to whoever was in that other driver's seat, I was going to pull him out and beat him, you know, to death. And as I'm walking and I'm lurching and I'm screaming, motherfucker, you know, like top of my lungs.
Yeah.
An old lady pops out of the driver's side. And in a moment, every aspect of machismo, violence that was surging through my blood fell the fuck away, and I realized my legs are shaking. I'm just scared. I'm not angry at this lady, and I rushed back to my family and, you know, helping them out and getting my daughter out and holding her. And I realized everything was fine. Nobody was ultimately hurt, and it was just this old lady who had bad vision fucked up, basically. And I was very apologetic to her later. But I saw in that moment how my anger was really just my deep-seated fear expressing itself violently through anger. And so there's interesting distinctions there, right?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it is, and I think some of it is just I guess because I am, you know, biased with this teaching of getting really comfortable with the idea that, you know, a certain kind of clean anger, because also I think it's, you know, again, I don't think it necessarily means I am totally not of the school that, you know, I frankly, maybe you can call it conservative. I think that there's some real lack of health, frankly, in like the fact that the culture has gotten so like everybody always needs to express their feelings all the time. Like I think actually a lot of time it's totally unnecessary and counterproductive. I don't want to, you know, get back to like people repressing themselves, but I don't think like, you know, just because you, you know, feel and are clear about something. And, you know, again, the right move out of that might be like, oh, well, this is something I need to be really tactical about. You know what I mean? One move, like it could be that, like, yes, I feel terrified. I also feel absolutely justifiably enraged. But actually, let me take a beat. And the most important thing right now is to A, protect my family and attend to them. And B, you know, if that was like a stoned kid in a car,
yeah, you
actually wouldn't want to catch a bid for beating the shit out of them, even if they deserved it, frankly.
Right.
But I think it's like, I think that it's that, you know, again, the reason I use that Lula example is, again, it's like there is this incredible comfort with a really wide range of expression. But it's not, and it is bigger, you know, and it's not, you know, it's on behalf of other people, it can be on behalf of yourself if it needs to be. But it isn't, you know, it isn't that kind of stuck, clingy, I'm mad, and and they did this, and yeah, 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 yeah. I actually think, like, because to me, that's so much of what that practice is kind of busting up. It's all that like second order bullshit, like, and that is where I do think like it's a conversation for another day, but I think everybody does need to read Exiting the Vampire Castle. And I think part of it, I think that there's real critiques that need to happen in the left. And I think people need to think in much more critical and creative ways about a variety of issues. But I also just think that like that's a consequence of the fact that while there is a correct revulsion at like the conservatism of much of religious New Age and therapeutic culture, you're also turning away and throwing away the idea that like human capacity building in terms of emotion, psychology, like any culture that dedicates itself to disregarding those domains is going to produce really unhealthy culture.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I do think sort of the social media chaos, that everybody calling each other out, the one-upmanship, it's sort of deeply counterproductive, and it's a manifestation of a sort of I hesitate to say neoliberal postmodernism, but in a way it's kind of true, because there is like this infinite array of singular narratives, and there's no way to connect those narratives up in any meaningful sense. And so it's just, your identity becomes a bludgeon by which to beat somebody else over the head with, or it's really performative, right? You're performing your ego, and you're showing how smart you are to everybody else. And that really disallows nuance and humanity and humility. So the platforms, of course, tend to this because it gets engagement, and
they incentivize that. Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's another actual perfect dialectic, right? Of like, that's a perfect example of how the tendencies are incentivized through the actual material, the platform itself, the actions that it incentivizes, and the practices that it triggers. So, and then, and then you have like, a conception of like being on the left, which means like sitting on predatory tech company platforms and trying to, tear down other people in a subculture.
Right.
It's just like, okay, if that's your version of the left, I think if I'm Peter Thiel, I'm definitely not worried about it. So I think that, but more broadly, there has to be, Marianne, one of the things I found, I really was enjoying watching Marianne Williamson deal with Dave Rubin. And partially to me, it was just because, Dave, and it's hilarious. I mean, Dave shouldn't be arrogant going up against anybody. But I think it's funny because I think he had the same perception that I see so many people, in my crew, tweet, here's this like, new age, whatever, get the fuck out of here. And meanwhile, she's, of course, infinitely more well-read and informed than he is. But it was very interesting to me to watch her, like, even just say, like, as an example, like, he was like, ooh, like, if I take collective responsibility for racism, isn't that like I'm going to be guilty for something I didn't do? And she's just like, no, it's not about guilt. It's about collective responsibility. I mean, that is such an elegant and obvious distinction, which both neutralizes a narcissistic, racist talking point of the right, and then also, frankly, counteracts against this ridiculous, performative, like, toxic emotional nonsense on the left of really actually trying to like personalize all of these things into like interpersonal acts of like weird repentance plays instead of like serious, combination of like, obviously like, of taking on things structurally, right? And so what's so funny to me is like that's one of the reasons I've been defending Marianne Williamson is like in a way it's like no, and on the flip side, she's actually also rebuking the new age culture that birthed her and she was a success in, because she is saying it is clearly not just sufficient to individually think positively, because we have all of these social problems we need to take care of collectively. So here, here's someone, and again, she's not perfect and blah, 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 but here's somebody who's like so many people are dismissing or like turning into a meme. And it's like, guys, she's actually more elegantly handling a lot of these dynamics than a lot of people who have a lot more credentials and maybe in some ways sophistication than her.
Yeah, I think I even tweeted about her and some of the cynicism surrounding her. Obviously, in a lot of ways she's an idealist, and her political project is not one that I, as a Marxist, am on board with. But what she does bring to this entire political sphere that people underestimate, and I think exactly what you're gesturing at, is a genuine sincerity and authenticity that you just never see. I mean, think of the Ted Cruzes and the Trumps and the Bidens of the world. Everybody, and the Kamala Harrises, these careerists. They're so cynical that everything is like PR tested and then pushed out to the population. And she's just being so fully sincere in an age of hyper irony and cynicism that in and of itself is sort of a breath of fresh air in our politics.
Absolutely. And I think also genuinely synthesizing some of these things and again, I just thought that distinction that she made about collective responsibility and structure, and it's so funny because I could totally see Dave Rubin making that, again, just a totally appalling, immoral, ahistorical, anything you could put on him, I will put on him point. Like, oh, I don't want to feel guilty. But then the answer being, well, you should feel guilty, like this whole, and then all of a sudden it's just this like performance piece about, and look, I'm not saying it's the same. Look, somebody who is acknowledging in this instance the reality of structural racism is inherently on higher ground than somebody who denies it. But at the same time, I know that as a matter of political and material practice, one's personal guilt and performance is not going to do the trick. And I also know that outside of a very narrow left-wing subculture, most people across the board of backgrounds have no interest in these kind of performances. They do care about the actual delivery of real things. And so the fact that she managed to just totally bypass that bullshit and take it back to a collective problem, and in that case actually get to some material solutions, I was like, wow, look, like she's doing a better job than almost anybody in that instance.
Yeah. And, you made me think, too, of like this whole concept of guilt, and especially in a hyper individualized society like our own, what all these, like when you're looking at, let's say, structural white supremacy, right? What the status quo, the sort of ideology of our time wants to do is sort of invert that awareness into something personal and individualistic, and that can only be sort of internalized as a personal sensation of guilt, which is not productive and can only ever be sort of a performance of showing others how guilty you feel, and the other side of that is, and this is what our society does not want, is to realize, now, fuck guilt, fuck my individual personal feelings about this or that. I have an obligation to other human beings. We have a responsibility to every other person on this planet, and that gives rise to a structural and collectivist approach to solving these problems that does not get sort of filtered through the prism of hyper-individualism and become another feeling that you have, but can actually result in collective struggle, which is the only way forward,
Yeah, no, I think that's really it. And then I think the other paradox is I actually think from that place of actually honesty and openness, then there is actually more room for the dimension of that sort of like, transformative work and change and atonement, like all of those things. But if it's just from a place of turning it into micro, performance art and like toxic relationships and performance across social media space, then it both is not going to do the job that it needs to do. And it's also, and again, this is where I'm, just really objective. Like I don't want to be part of an ongoing political subculture.
Yeah.
I want people to actually gain power, and I want to actually do things. And I know that a lot of and that's why so much of my politics, again, it rests on like, yes, I think that there are things that would be overwhelmingly popular with people across the board. And the reason we don't have them is definitely because of like just, concentrations of wealth and power. And then I think there's other areas where the distinction is actually really simple, which is like, would I, like as an example, if you told me, hey, like, we could get a left-wing agenda, but we have to endorse, concentration camps. No, that's the moral, right? Like, no, absolutely not. But then conversely, we aren't going to do this until everybody shares all of our, cultural habits and language and agrees with every single opinion that people may or may not have on various, social trends or controversies. It's like, first of all, a lot of us disagree with ourselves about those things, and most normal people are absolutely don't give a fuck. And, I think a lot of people can actually be persuaded on really basic moral stuff across the board, but they're not interested in being, forced to conform to a subculture and be enlisted in that. And again, I think it does relate somewhat to the practices we've been talking about, which is, and again, even just like discerning those distinctions. As we actually engage with hopefully a much broader set of people in the real world.
Yeah, and insofar as this practice cultivates a sense of humility and works against narcissism and ego-centered, traits in an individual, you start to lose that narcissism that says everybody should, talk and think and behave like me, and you start realizing, actually, I have to go out and I have to do the work of trying to educate people. I have to educate myself on these topics, and I have to go out and communicate these ideas in a way that people actually care about and are meaningful in their world. And when you do that, you're surprised to see just how progressive a lot of regular working class people's instincts and intuitions really are. It's just a matter of meeting them where they are and doing that work of education, which is much harder than posting something online for a bunch of likes and shitting on everybody who disagrees with you, And so that easiness, that laziness is part of the problem.
And also as part of that process too, I would say, like, again, without, with the clear, just the lines of clarity, obviously, but there's other times where it's like, oh, this person's actually right about something. Like, I'm wrong.
Oh yeah, all the time.
Like, you know what I mean? Like, That's like the other thing that it's like, because I even get weary of that other discourse of people is like, no, absolutely, we need to like have humility and go out there and realize that everybody's great and they're on board for our project. I don't know, and that's why I do think that for me, the politics, and maybe this loops back to the first question, is like, I think that there needs like power over your economic life and absolute security and things like housing and healthcare are just like indivisible. Like, I just don't know a human being that doesn't need those things. And then there's like the broader, which is like, can the category of your identity be used to block your civic rights? And this is where I think of it, frankly, I do think of it in a pretty liberal way. Like, it's like, no, it can't be. And people's rights and expression, an ability to safely kind of exercise who they are, needs to be ensured. And then, but then beyond that, it's like, there's going to be a ton of people who are still like, they want to have like 8 kids and go to baseball games, like there's going to be other people who want to like generally be in like a more narrow cultural subset. Like, these, and my kind of test is like, well, are you on board for like, co-owning and co-managing your business across all of these lines in a democratized economy? Do you understand that we need to get rid of police violence against certain populations? If you're down for that, then like, I don't give a fuck what comedy you listen to, what cultural habits you have, what beliefs you have, frankly. And I think that there needs to be a lot less kind of focus on sort of socially engineering imagined people that you probably don't even know to begin with.
Exactly right. Exactly right. I think it was Lenin that talked about that as like, some of these, utopians or idealists on the left, they wanted to create a world out of people that don't yet exist. And he's like, as Marxists, we have to go with people as they actually are and work from there. And I thought that was always sort of interesting.
No, that's beautiful. Yep.
Yeah, let's go ahead and two more questions. I know we skipped a bunch of questions. That's just inevitable. I have two more, and then we'll go into the conclusion. How does your meditation practice inform your politics and vice versa? Right? How do you view that relationship personally inside yourself?
Well, I don't want to cop out, but I've been spelling it out. I think that to me, it's ineffable, and I don't necessarily. I mean, look. One of the things it's a whole other topic. I'll go so far as to say a slightly traumatic experience for me has been looking at Burma. When I grew up in the context of doing this spiritual practice, and the reason I call it Burma is that when I first was exposed to Myanmar, it was primarily through people that traveled frequently to Burma, both because they did serious, intensive Buddhist practice and because they usually had some connections to what at that point was the anti-junta movement, and the anti-junta movement did not call the country Myanmar; they called it Burma, and it was a political signifier at that time. So I understand it is Myanmar, and that's sort of general consensus now. But I grew up in you call it Burma, and that means you're against the junta. So, anyways, that's part of the habit I have. But Aung San Suu Kyi coming into power. And my first experience of her, my first thing actually, honestly, with some of the compromises she made, I even co-wrote a piece actually in 2013 called The Politics of Sainthood, where my co-author and I were sort of arguing like, Aung San Suu Kyi, yes, this is an incredible leader with a lot of physical courage, and she's also a politician. And, she's not going to come out of the gate in a democratic transition and do everything we want her to do. And now, of course, a couple years later, what is beyond abundantly clear is like, no, her politics have actually always been, yes, there is this physical courage, but she is a narrow Buddhist and ethnic nationalist and chauvinist, and she harbors horrific politics. And, there is a Rohingya genocide happening right now, part of the engine of which is a form of, Buddhist fascism, frankly. So I am under zero illusions of the idea that there's also a really fascinating book called Zen at War about, very sophisticated Zen teachers that help provide like context and propaganda for Japanese imperial adventures. I don't think that, I guess the way my politics informs it is I don't think that there's some magical technique that can make everybody love each other and, deal with all of our problems. Now, on the other hand, there is not a single moment in left-wing politics or in media or even in our national life where I don't think I like Cornel West's language. Like, yeah, we're incredibly spiritually sick and malnourished. And so many conversations and so many serious problems clearly need love, they need wisdom, they need compassion. We need to not feel embarrassed when we say these words. And, and that there are incredibly potent practices and teachings and ideas that can help us, at the very least, build a much healthier left-wing political culture. I mean, Joshua Kahn is another person who means a lot to me. He's on my show a lot, a Wildfire Project, and is a climate and general, serious activist and organizer, and he's done a lot of work with First Nations people. And it's like, yeah, he's a Marxist and so on, but there is a dimension to this that is, for lack of a better word, and I really wish there was a better word, but it is spiritual. It is not just a question of it's certainly not the liberal people becoming woke and, having a bunch of new kind of like, social practices and social agreements. Some of those are good, some of those are not good, whatever. And it's not even the deeper structural critiques, which are indispensable. You can't get anywhere without them. But I do think that there's something there that is felt individually and collectively. And and it has to, it's part of the picture. I don't know how that manifests, but so the ways those two things inform is in the first examples, there's no magical spiritual out of history and politics. And then conversely, we're spiritually sick and we need to deal with it. So that's my dialectic.
Yeah. Totally agree with that. And I think the big word you're getting towards is the sense of connection. In a hyper-atomized, competitive, individualistic society, especially a consumer society that, not only makes you an atomized individual, but urges you to consume as your main behavioral pattern, these principles and values and the sort of traits that a good practice can cultivate within yourself are antithetical to those shallow, dead-end approaches of the way that one lives their life. It increases connection not only with nature, but with other people and with yourself. And that can then turn around and make you a better educator, a better friend, a better partner, a better organizer. For me, both traditions really chip away at my sense of individualism and selfishness from both directions, right? I'm very much a collectivist in a lot of ways. I'm an anti-individualist. and so probably that's why Marxism and Buddhism have been the two philosophies that I've consistently gravitated towards more than anything else. Both of them chip away the meditative practice literally from an internal standpoint, the sense of self that gives rise to petulance and ego narcissism is chipped away at. And then on the Marxist side, the sense of I just need to recoil into my personal life and do what makes me happy. That's chipped away and replaced with a sense of obligation and responsibility towards other people, other sentient creatures on this planet and the planet as a whole, nature, preserving nature, etc. And then I think both Marxism and Buddhism, in the sense that we're talking about it, are a theory that inexorably urges one into practice, right? It's very hard to be merely an intellectual theoretician when it comes to meditation and Marxism, right? The more you read of the theory, the more you are nudged and sometimes shoved into actual action. You can't separate those two. And so on those different aspects, I think.
Thinking, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm just thinking of Marx, it's like, it's not, it's our, I'm butchering it, but basically, it isn't our job now to sort of theorize history. It's to change it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, in the Buddhist, like there's that Buddhist parable, which they use to kind of, sort of slightly de-emphasize focus on kind of like cosmic speculation, where, the Buddha's getting all those questions about, okay, well, all right, so there's gods, but like, where did that come from? And why is there karma? And why? And blah, blah, blah. And he's like, basically like, you're a dude who got shot with a poison arrow, and I'm a doctor who has the path to remove it. And it's now you're asking me like, where did the arrow come from? And all that. He's like, just like, help me get this arrow out.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like, the job is to liberate. The job is to change history. I think you're right. I think both of those traditions at their best, there's a huge amount of like, right, we got to theorize this well and understand it. But then, but then even, it's not even just that then we act, it's that we can't theorize it well and understand it without acting.
Exactly.
That is actually a way in which the meditation practice can be really fun in a dialectical Marxist sense, because you literally are theorizing what's happening and how it works. And then you're doing it. And then you have like a real-time feedback loop to your model.
It's incredibly fascinating. And in the same way, on the Marxism edge of things, when you go out and you organize, you are also learning that learning things that you turn around and embed into your theory in the same way that you do it there. So there's that feedback loop between theory and practice, and both philosophies, this sort of dialectical relationship between the two that is beautiful and really complementary. So yeah, it's definitely made me less navel gazing, less self-absorbed, and made me outward looking and figure out how can I use my life to help other human beings. And once you ask yourself that question, as much as we don't want to get caught into the very liberal, be the change you want to see in the world sort of approach, there is some kernel of truth in that. If you are a bitter, angry, traumatized, hurt, jealous person, it makes you a much less effective organizer and educator. And so if we're talking about self-care, or we're just talking about how to make me the best sort of organizer and political educator that I can possibly be, it goes back to cultivating within you this sense of humility and serenity and awareness of the pitfalls of your thoughts and emotions, etc. So done best, done well, done in conjunction, these two things are not at odds, but can actually be very complementary. And that's sort of a beautiful thing,
Definitely.
All right. So last question before the conclusion, and that's just to be fair, what are some good, valid, or otherwise valuable criticisms of, or more importantly, warnings about this practice that you think are worth mentioning to anybody who's maybe become interested in this stuff during this discussion, but you want to warn them against some common pitfalls? What would you say to that question?
One is you should definitely be really thoughtful about, certainly anybody you do any kind of actual, if you wanted to do like intensive practice, like go on a retreat, I would, I'm obviously I've primarily gone to the Insight Meditation Society. I think, there are teachers that are probably pretty hard maybe to sit with, but just in terms of like their booking and their schedule. But I would be, if you're going to do intensive practice, you should be extremely thoughtful about who you do it with. And I don't just mean, like, I'm not getting into like the real, more generally, obviously, there's a huge amount of cult activity and stuff, and you should look up any group you're interested in and all of that. But even less dramatically, like, you could be sitting with somebody who's, an above board person and whatever, but like, they might not get you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. They might, like, it might be, and it's an extremely, it's not, it isn't like so many other interactions, right? Like it isn't where, again, I actually kind of think like, yeah, you know what, like, yeah, people make mistakes, whatever. But this is this is the type of environment where, you're in like a totally radically open space and people say something that you misinterpret or they like don't get. And, it can be super subtle, but it can be pretty unhelpful. So I would both do research and seriously check your gut before getting into deep with anything like that. And I guess in a similar vein, like kind of explore too, like what way of approaching the practice is going to be best for you. Because I do think that even some approaches that are like, extremely enlightened and really good, they could still teach things in a way like I'll say Michelle McDonald. I mean, this is someone, I've done a lot of retreats with her and Jesse Vega, these are two people and obviously, I mean, certainly Joseph Goldstein, although there's differences between the three, but Joseph's just like these are all like very high quality human beings, but like, Michelle teaches this in a really different way and in a way that I think is really helpful for, particular kinds of people. It's certainly helpful for me. So, check it out and don't get dogmatic. I mean, as an example, I think like I haven't actually done one of those just because I wasn't inducted in it, but like, the Goenka, I mean, Mr. Goenka passed away, but like those Goenka 10-day retreats, I know a ton of people who've had incredible experiences doing them. But I'm also I'm a little bit more wary than I used to be of like the idea, like there's a power and a beauty in going to a place where you're, for 10 days, you follow a rigidly regimented schedule and you sit and you sit and you sit and you sit and that's it. But then there's also like maybe you go on a retreat to a place where it's actually still, frankly, a pretty disciplined, limited schedule, but like you can go take a walk, and taking that walk isn't just like you not being disciplined or whatever. Maybe that's like really what you need to do. You know what I'm saying? So I would, yeah. So those are kind of the things I would check out. I mean, I think, as far as the broader pitfalls, I mean, I think we've talked about some of those. I think there is a huge amount of misconceptions about what the practice is, about why certain people think they can't or can't do it. There's, I think fortunately overall, particularly if you're interested in Vipassana, it's probably relatively speaking pretty safe. But there's definitely, obviously if you get broadly into the world of spirituality, there's a ton of cults. So
yeah,
I would look out for that.
I think that's incredibly important. It took me a long time. I first got introduced to like Taoism in a hospital because I was hospitalized for depression in my teens, and that was the first sort of ever hint of Eastern philosophy that I got was from a nurse there who handed me this book on Taoism and said, you're a smart kid, you might actually find this pretty interesting, and that led me down a long path of sort of learning all these different methods and different schools of thought. And so it took me a really long time to find the teachers and approach that fits best with me. So start slow, don't jump into anything over your head. Before you go on a long retreat, I would say put in a lot of time with like 10, 20, 30-minute sessions, so you sort of get a good idea of what you're doing before you get plunged into the solitude, which can be a huge challenge to somebody, especially if you don't have that base level of practice sort of already down, And then I would warn deeply against two errors on each side. I would warn against those who insist that you adopt certain anti-scientific metaphysical beliefs or that have too much woo-woo sounding bullshit infused into it. You can think of like the Deepak Chopra types of the world. If you're listening to my or Michael's show, I assume you're a little bit more scientifically minded and skeptical. So anything that...
I probably like Deepak Chopra more than anybody who watches my show.
Really? Oh, that's weird. A whole nother episode on that one.
Well, partially I'm just, I'm a little bit of a contrarian and I love provoking people with this stuff. No, I mean, look, so a few of his things that I've read are actually just sort of like, popular versions of the Vedas, which I think is fascinating. Mm-hmm. You know what? I have a problem, and I don't know this, but because I just don't know the area. I really don't like when, people hinge their spiritual arguments on saying that like, quantum physics validates it or something.
Exactly.
I think that is, I think that because to me it's bullshit on both ends, because I think it's scientifically, I assume it's bullshit because that's what the people in the field say mostly. But then I also think it's like I think looking at the Vedas or, that can be really fascinating and interesting. And I think adopting different cognitive frames of the world is useful. I don't mean, of course, I'm talking about, I'm not saying like, oh, adopt the idea that the world is 3,000 years old. Like that's just false. But I'm talking like broader structural like capacity to move in between worldviews, I think is actually super valuable. So to me, it's like, and it is, I think, also true in India. I listened to an interview with a very highly regarded Indian physicist recently, and he was kind of just like, he's also quite observant, and he was just like, yeah, like in India, this kind of split in both directions is genuinely less pronounced in some ways, right? Like the idea that you need to like jettison material realities in order to have like a very spiritually infused worldview is just a little bit different there. But that being said, and I don't even know if I accept that argument, but regardless, I don't like it from either direction, because I think like you should just be able to, like explore something like the Vedas, in its own terms. And again, where I don't like the kind of like, well, that's not true, so I won't read that. I really think I wish people would let go of that perspective and enlarge their capacity not to accept things, but to think about things and engage with things. Sure. And then on the other hand, yeah, I think it's actually kind of a disaster to hinge spiritual validity on rapidly changing physics and science that you're probably almost certainly misunderstanding to begin with.
Yeah. I just mean like I used him as an example, but the worst excess is, you can get pushed in the direction of like the secret or like extreme forms of idealism, and I just think just be skeptical is what I'm saying. But then on the other side is this, and I think you were getting at this a little bit, I would warn especially against those who want to strip the practice of its ethical foundation, strip it completely from its Buddhist context, and strip it from like the notion that you are trying to gain insight into selflessness and impermanence, right? And I think the obvious form of that is like using it in Silicon Valley for productivity and efficiency, but also in more subtle ways that can be done as well. I think the Buddhist context is important to engage with, and I think having an ethical foundation throughout the practice and really thinking about ethics in conjunction with your meditative practice can go a long way in blunting some of the worst edges of where this practice can go if it's totally unhinged from any sort of ethical commitments whatsoever.
Yep.
All right. Well, this has been a long episode. Thank you so much for coming on. It's almost 2 hours now. We didn't even get to all the questions, but I'm sure this will create some dialogue in our audiences, and we have plenty of Q&As on our Patreons for people to pursue some questions they might have. But as we're wrapping up here, what recommendations or resources would you offer for people who might want to get into this practice as a total beginner, somebody who, has no experience at all but wants to find a way in? What would you recommend to them?
So I would definitely recommend there's some podcasts from Joseph Goldstein and then actually also Jack Kornfield, who are like, and Sharon Salzberg, who are basically three of the prime people that actually brought this stuff over. There's The Heart of Wisdom by Jack Kornfield. There's the Insight Hour with Joseph Goldstein. For me personally, I'm a really big fan of just the talks of Baba Ram Dass, who was like another important figure in this stuff, partially just because he was just like this incredible storyteller. Like it is an incredibly entertaining public speaker. But that's very kind of broad flavor. I would really actually check out my friend Jesse's. He has a website called Do Less for Peace. And his writing on Vipassana, on politics, on Burma, it's fascinating. Like I would say, like I think the bourgeoisie blues, the prices and perils of genetically modified dharma is a very and the PGB and the false promise of mindfulness. I think these are. I think for people who, I'm just assuming coming from this, listening to your show, they're going to have a really sharp and critical bent. And Jesse writes exactly to that and has a very deep understanding of that. And we'll specifically talk about like the historical process of political economy and how Marx's, modes of production relate to how Buddhism is disseminated in the West, and then how that's actually affecting how we're processing mindfulness. So I think it's both like a really good intellectual grip, and I think it also really will show for people who are, strongly in the left and are rightly allergic to so much of the bullshit that this line of inquiry is really compatible. I think The Experience of Insight by Joseph Goldstein is a really good book. One of their podcasts is Dharma Seed. This is just like collected talks of Buddhist teachers across the country. But, I don't know. I don't know what, I'm trying to give like a range of things because there's a lot of different pathways of what people are going to resonate and find interesting.
Yeah, I don't think you can go wrong with, as you said, I even had this written down, like Joseph Goldstein, Sharon Salzberg, Jack Kornfield. Those are really interesting people who don't strip it out of its Buddhist context and who have been practicing this stuff for literally, in Joseph Goldstein's case, over 50 years. At times, he would go out for 1 or 2 year retreats. So this is somebody who is very humble, but has obviously achieved high levels in this field. And then, we live in an app-dominated society, and I'm not one of these people that thinks this is anathema to practice. So I think there's guided apps like 10% Happier, which was actually made with Joseph Goldstein. And so you'll get talks from Sharon Salzberg and Jack Kornfield and guided meditations in this 10% Happier app that I think you can get for free. I'm sure you can pay for more stuff, but there's good stuff there. And I'd really recommend, especially people trying to get into the practice itself, to try those guided apps. And then one person that, inspired me from a very young age and who was instrumental in getting me sort of involved with the philosophy behind this stuff when I was a teenager and early 20-something was Alan Watts. He's this weird theologian, scientist, philosopher guy from England, I think. But you go on YouTube and they have a lot of little clips of him talking about this stuff, lots of interviews with them. His books are great. And so that's really inspirational philosophy that you can really get into and see why this stuff matters and what its implications are, that I think is accessible and genuinely fascinating for people to jump into.
Yeah, I mean, I would kind of put Ram Dass in. I think that's sort of complementary with Alan Watts.
Agreed.
And one other person, if you're more, this is maybe a little bit more of a reach, but I think Krishnamurti is another pretty fascinating,
love him,
kind of philosopher. Yeah, I mean, he's on the end of like this real kind of, actually at times incredibly poetic and touching, but in other ways like just incredibly ruthless assessment of our human predicament.
Oh yeah.
I mean, Krishnamurti's powerful. And one last thing, I think a book that's super accessible, but is like not. I mean, Sayadaw U Pandita taught a huge amount of Westerners and was very much part of that direct relationship between Burma and the United States and Vipassana. But he was a Burmese lineage holder and a very traditional teacher in some ways. So it's kind of interesting to get that flavor. So he wrote a book called In This Very Life by Sayadaw Pandita, which is another like very good, just sort of like, I mean, basically life is super short. You should do Vipassana because it's a unique opportunity and then you're going to die. But it's very powerful.
Hell yeah.
Check it out. Yeah.
All right. Well, that should be a bunch of recommendations for people to get started. You can always reach out to me or Michael on Twitter too, and we could help you with more specified needs if you have that. But Michael, thank you so much for coming on. It's been awesome to finally make this happen. Let's continue to collaborate in the future on different topics because we have a good vibe together, and I think our conversations are genuinely interesting to people. So before we let you go, though, can you point to people where they can find you and your work online for anybody that wants to follow your work?
Well, first of all, Brett, absolutely, I agree 100%. And I do get antsy on a weekday night with the amount of stuff I have to do, and this time totally flew by. So
yeah, right?
It was awesome. Thank you. It's my honor. We'll definitely do more. Yeah, I mean, the prime way, if you want to get the whole show, and there really is a lot of history content, that is sort of the basis of the show in some ways. But you can go check it out. I don't have to give a whole spiel, but check out patreon.com/TMBS. We have an extremely active, obviously you can see, people see me on Sam Seder, Majority Report on YouTube, but Michael Brooks' show on YouTube now is almost at 60,000 subs. And in the last several months, we've turned that into like a very real channel with a lot of clips, as well as the full main show. And, we cover a fair amount of things with a more left emphasis, but, there's a lot of, there's definitely a lot of stuff on, Sanders, the U.S. election. But I would say, especially for that space, there's deep dives on Thomas Sankara, on dialectics. We cover Latin America, the political imprisonment of Lula extensively, but also other topics like, redefining human rights to enlarge them, anarchist critique of technology, you'll get a pretty decent flavor of the show, and it's a great way to engage with it. And then you can find me on Twitter and Instagram and all the rest of that stuff.
Absolutely, and we'll link to a lot of that in the show notes so people can find Michael easier. All right, Michael, thanks so much, man. Let's keep in touch and do this again, brother.
My honor, brother. Thank you so much. Have a great night.
You too. Solidarity.
Solidarity.